Those in my class should have 3 handouts. You have 2 new articles. One is primarily written for the husband, and one's written for the wife, and I couldn't decide which one to give first and who I was going to get in trouble with, so I just said I'll give them both at once. They're a little bit longer articles, but they're dealing with the subject we're talking about now, and I think it'll be helpful to you to go through it together as a couple and discuss, because not everything is there's going to be true about your husband or your wife. And they need to clarify what's important to them, and you need to ask questions and talk about these issues, and those are good articles to do that with. And so I hope you'll take time when you get home, not while I'm talking, to read those articles. And then along with that, the handout, we've got the second page of the lesson. I don't know if we'll get that far or not, but I want you to look at the back, page 27 there of the lesson, the next page there. Read the cartoon real quick, and then look there for further study. There's a list of books that are there on this topic of physical intimacy. And I want to encourage you, these are good books to read no matter how long you've been married. I've got some of the books up here in the front, and you can come up afterwards and take a look and maybe take one. And for those of you a little embarrassed about this topic, I even got you a brown paper bag to put it into, and it was really appropriate. I went down to get the bags, and it says, "I'm loving it" on there. So that's also kind of appropriate with that. But of these books, I want to mention just a couple of them. There's one little booklet here called The Act of Marriage. This is kind of a classic. It's written by Tim LaHaye. And this is one that I often will recommend to a newly married couple especially, or just to a couple that really never laid the foundations there. And he goes through it. It's especially a good book for a newly married couple, but it can also be good for a couple that's been married for a while. There's another book he has called The Act of Marriage After 40. And so it just talks about how it changes and how we need to adjust to those changes. There's a book I do not have up here called Intended for Pleasure, written by Dr. Wheat. Dr. Wheat is a medical doctor and a Christian, and he wrote a book on the physical relationship. Again, an excellent, excellent book. If you want to give a gift to a newly married couple, I would highly recommend that gift. And it's a good book for you. Again, it deals with the foundational basics that sometimes we didn't get. We think we had, but we didn't. And it goes into other things as well. There's a couple other good books up here or mentioned in your list. Dr. Lehman has a good book called Sheet Music, and he's got a follow-up. I forget what the name of that one is. And there's a couple others up here that we have from our library that you're welcome to borrow. He also wrote one, Sex in the Kitchen, Begins in the Kitchen. And it's more like preparing yourselves and looking through the whole day. In the list there, the last 2, What Wives Wish Their Husbands Knew About Sex, and Is That All He Thinks About? That's written for the wife. And these are both good books to read individually as a husband or wife, or even to read together as a couple and talk about it. And so I would encourage you to take a look at these. Most of them you can download as a Kindle. You can also get them used for a pretty cheap price, or if you want to buy them brand new, I'm sure Amazon has most of these available there. And so you can take a look at that. But let's go ahead and turn to our notes and take a look where we're at. I believe we're on page 25 of the notes. And we're talking about the physical relationship, and this is the second, not 25 for you, I'm sorry, I give you the page numbers. My page numbers are different than yours. So 15, and so page 15 in your notes. And we are on number 2 there towards the, again, I'm not sure where this page is. It's Roman number 2, letter A, number 2 is where we're at. Not a choice, but a command. Not a choice, but a command. Turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. A lot of couples look at this as kind of an optional thing. It's something that if I feel like it, okay. If I don't feel like it, okay. I'm amazed at the number of couples I've talked to who don't have a physical relationship at all anymore, or really never have, or have a very minimal one. And I believe you are sinning. I'm going to be very straightforward. If you're not having a regular physical relationship within your marriage, then you are sinning against God. Every time God talks about a husband and wife, when a man and a wife leave their parents and come together to cleave to one another, he uses the phrase one flesh. And so that means that one flesh physical relationship is a key element of a marriage relationship. Now, don't misunderstand me. Just having sex doesn't make a good marriage. But if you have a good marriage, you're going to have sex. And if you don't have sex, you're not going to have a good marriage. It's going to affect both ways. And so we need to understand that. So it's very, very important that you understand the priority of this in your marriage. And if you are not having sex in your marriage, you need to do this. Sometimes the most spiritual and the most godly thing you can do is to go home and have sex. It is just a command of God. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. Now, concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, nevertheless to avoid fornication. By the way, it is good not to be too touchy, too physical with the opposite sex that you're not married to. Be very, very careful of that. It doesn't mean you can't touch it like shaking hands or something like that, or even giving somebody a hug, but you need to be very, very careful of that in your life. But number 2, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud you not. Now that's a strong term. To defraud somebody is a very strong term. If somebody came and took all your money out of your bank account, you'd be upset about that. If somebody came and took your house away from you somehow or another, you'd be upset about that. And when you're taking that sexual relationship away from your partner, that's fraud. That's fraud. They got married expecting to be able to have a physical relationship with you, and you need to fulfill that promise. Defraud you not one the other, except to be consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, but come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. So we need to understand, letter A there is plan and prepare for a regular time and place. Part of having a regular relationship, you need to be having sex on a regular basis. You need to be having time with each other. And part of that process is planning and preparing for a regular time. When and where are you going to do this? Nothing wrong with scheduling sex, especially in our busy schedules today. There's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, Saturday night or Monday night or whatever day it is going to be, or Monday afternoon, whatever works for you is the time we're going to schedule and plan. That's our time to have set every week where we can have sex together. And so it's important to have a plan and important to prepare for it. And we're looking forward to it. We know if it doesn't happen before, then it's going to happen at that point. And I think you ought to, every one of you as a couple ought to have a time set on a regular basis where you're going to get together. Now, there will be exceptions to that rule. There will be sometimes something comes up, but you need to make it a priority. You need to make it an appointment. You need to put everything else aside, and this is time for us to have together, and we're going to work towards it. Now, Satan will do what he can to mess that up, whether it's the kids or whether it's the job or other things. And when that happens, you need to then make up for that date. But you need to make it so this is our regular time. This is our regular day. Number 2, you need to be tuned in and you need to be turned on. You need to be tuned in and you need to be turned on. You know, sometimes you have to prime the pump. So you need to be tuned into one another. You as a wife need to be tuned into your husband's needs. And you as a husband need to be tuned into your wife's needs and paying attention to those little signals. We all have signals that we put out that we want sex. And most of the time, our spouse either doesn't recognize them or they ignore them because they don't want to acknowledge and then have to have that time with us because their priorities are somewhere else at the time. And so one of the things to be careful of is make sure your spouse knows what your signals are. Make sure they know what it is that you do or say that indicates, hey, I'm interested. And it can be just a phrase that you use. It can be a way that you look at them. It can be something that you say or something you do. It can be very subtle, but don't make sure it's not so subtle they don't catch the hint. And so many times I've talked to spouses who got mad at their spouse because they wanted sex and they thought that the spouse should have known that they wanted by their subtle hints. And the spouse didn't catch that. So make sure it's not too subtle. And if you're going to be subtle, that they understand this is not too subtle here. And letting them know. And sometimes it's just outright. I know some couples that have made, like for example, I remember one couple, they had a little knick-knack. And they would move that knickknack to a certain place when they wanted to have time with their partner. And when they walked in the bedroom and saw it there, they knew, okay, this has got to be the night here because they want to have time. And if they didn't want it, if there's some reason they couldn't, they would move it back. And sometimes it would move back and forth about 3 or 4 times before they finally said, okay, I'll leave it there. And doing that. But you've got to be tuned into one another. You've got to pay attention to the signals. You've got to know what those signals are and not ignore them. Ignoring them doesn't make them go away. And so you've got to, if you see the signals, you need to come out and say, is this what you want? And maybe we can't do it, or it's not going to work, or how about later, or whatever else it might be. You need to be tuned in and you need to be turned on. Sometimes you need to prime the pump. Sometimes one or the other needs to do things to prime that pump, whether it's dressing a certain way, or whether it's thinking a certain way, or just go take a long bath, or whatever else it is. There are things that you can do as a partner to prepare yourself and get your mindset in that direction. Especially based upon your personality. If you're a beaver, you're looking at everything else, and that's kind of the last thing on your list. And you need to move it up as a priority, and you need to do things to get yourself more focused on that instead of waiting until the last minute and all of a sudden, oh yeah, we're supposed to get together here. And if you're a lion or whatever personality, you just need to make sure you're tuned in and that you're turned on. And then number C is be willing to be spontaneous. There is a time where sex needs to be spontaneous. It's just, hey, we got time. Hey, the kids aren't here. They're out with so-and-so, or they're at a friend's house, or just to be spontaneous and grab the moment. Now, that's taking that opportunity. I'm going to talk about this more later on. We're going to talk about the subject of pornography because it's a challenge that many men are struggling with dating, even some women as well. And I'll tell you, folks, one of the attractions of pornography is that it's always willing whenever you want it. And that's one of the biggest attractions of pornography. My wife is not always willing, but I can click on the internet and the girl on the internet is always willing. Now, that's wrong. I'm not endorsing it. I'm just trying to help you understand some of the thinking. Sometimes men look at pornography not because they want to look at another woman, but because that other woman is there and she's willing and ready to do whatever he wants. And his wife is not willing and not ready to do what he needs or what he wants. And so you need to understand that. So you need to be willing. You need to be ready. You need to plan and prepare. You need to have set times that we're going to set aside in order to connect with one another physically. You need to be tuned in. You need to be turned on. But you also need to be willing to be spontaneous with one another. And a lot of times, the husband's getting a little bit frisky, and the wife just kind of don't even think about it. It's kind of like the cartoon on the back of there. 100 ways and 100 positions and 1 or 2 ways to escape, And don't do that. Be willing. And then letter D is different times and different reasons. Different times and different reasons. Understand that we have sex at different times for different reasons. One is physical. Sometimes sex is just a physical release, especially for the man, but even for the woman. It's physical. Sometimes sex is for an emotional. Sometimes having sex is a way to let our emotions. We're stressed out with work. We're stressed out with the family. We're stressed out. And just getting together and being intimate, it just releases that emotion. Sometimes sex is about bonding. It's about we need to have it so we can just feel close to one another and bond with one another physically. And sometimes it's an expression of love. Sometimes you make love because you love one another. It's not about the physical release. It's not about the emotional release. It's not about bonding. It's really about expressing my love to you in a very physical, personal way. And then sometimes it's just for the pure pleasure or fun of it. God designed sex to be pleasurable. That's why he put all those nerve endings. I was reading a couple different articles, and the number of nerve endings in our genitalia is absolutely amazing. And God put them there for a reason, because he wants us to enjoy it. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying sex. There's nothing wrong with having some fun and just having a good time having sex together. And so sometimes, as a couple, you need to realize, well, this is just about, and understand, what are we trying to accomplish with this intimate time? Now, don't overdo it and don't overthink it, but sometimes it's good to know that my husband just needs a physical release right now. Sometimes it's good to know my wife needs me to bond with her. She just needs to feel close to me. Sometimes it's good to know that I want to just say how much I love you in a very personal, intimate way. What are you trying to accomplish? What are you doing that? Sometimes there'll be a combination of as well. Even when you're bonding with one another, it still feels good. There's nothing wrong with enjoying it. But what are we trying to accomplish here in that relationship? But the clear command of the Bible is the husband doesn't have power over his own body, it's his wife. And the wife over her own body, it's her husband. And that means if the husband says, hey, I want it, then the wife has an obligation, a responsibility to give. Now, don't give, all right, I guess I have to, and don't do it that way, and vice versa. And fellas, sometimes your wife just needs you to bond with her. She needs you to make love to her. And she needs to know that you want that and need that. And it's important in that process. So the Bible says that it's a one flesh relationship. The marriage bed is honorable in all. And so let her be as honorable. The word honorable means the price that is paid. The price that is paid. It's like an honorarium. When you go speak somewhere, you get an honorarium. You're given money for speaking. Now, I'm not suggesting you pay your spouse for having sex with you, okay? Although I do know some couples that they would have a money jar, and every time that they had sex, they would put money in that jar, and it was collect up for a second honeymoon on their 25th anniversary or something like that. And I think that's a good idea. There's nothing wrong with that. But we need to understand. But the root word of this word honorable, the root word it comes from means punishment or penalty. Now, again, I'm not saying, well, yeah, having sex with him is a punishment. It is a penalty, or vice versa. That's not what it's talking about. What it's saying is that you punish your spouse. You're penalizing them when you don't have sex with them. And so it's honorable that there's a price to be paid. It's like an honorarium. This is something I'm giving you because because you are my husband, because you're my wife. It's something we give to one another. And I believe that the idea of the word honorable is that it's for our pleasure. Go to Proverbs chapter 5. Proverbs chapter 5. Now, if you've read the devotions over the last few days, my wife was doing the proofreading of it. She says, I blushed, and I'm being very frank in those devotions. But you know what? The Bible's very frank. If you'll look, I'm being no more frank than the Bible is. This is what God talks about, because God designed sex. And he talks about it in the Bible. And this is one of the passages, Proverbs chapter 5, and beginning with verse number 15. It says, drink waters out of thine own cisterns and running waters out of thine own well. In other words, your spouse. You don't go looking for it elsewhere. You've got one person you can have sex from, that's your spouse. And like I've mentioned before, your husband, your wife can't go. If you don't feed them, they can go to McDonald's. They can go to Ruby Tuesdays. They can go to Pandas. But if you don't give them sex, there's nowhere they can go. And that's not fair if you don't do it to them, if you don't give it to them in your own home. Verse 16, let thy fountains be dispersed abroad and rivers of water in the street. Now, that's a sarcastic phrase. He says, you don't just let it go to everybody else. This is for yours. Verse 17, let them be only thine own and not a stranger's with thee. We don't share this with other people. This is why you don't do pornography. This is why it's a personal thing between husband and wife. And you don't share it with other people. But then verse 18, let thy fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Now, a fountain is a flowing water. In other words, the sexual relationship should be constantly moving, constantly flowing. That's what makes water fresh. When water sits, it gets stagnant. And your sexual relationship should be a cool, refreshing flow in your life, in your relationship. And rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as a loving hind and pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. And why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman, embrace the bosom of a stranger? For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he pondereth all his goings. His own iniquity shall take the wicked himself, and he shall be holden with the cords of his sin. He shall die without instruction, the greatness of his folly shall go astray. When you get into pornography, when you commit adultery, you're heading in a very, very bad direction. And so we need to be careful of that. But I want to look specifically at verses 18 through 20 there. And I want to talk about some of the words there. First of all, fountain. Let's turn over to Song of Solomon, chapter 4. Song of Solomon, chapter 4. This is the chapter wherein I just wrote about in devotions. I think you get it tomorrow or something. But Song of Solomon, chapter 4, and verses 10 through 15. It says, how fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse. How much better is thy love than wine, and the smell of thine ointments than all spices. Thy lips, O my spouse, drop as the honeycomb. Honey and milk are under thy tongue, and the smell of thy garments is like the smell of Lebanon. A garden enclosed. Remember, a garden is a description of a woman's personal, intimate parts. My spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. The plants are an orchard of pomegranates with pleasant fruits, camphor, fire with spikenard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon with all trees of frankincense, myrrh and aloes with all the chief spice, a fountain of gardens, a well of living waters, and stream from Lebanon. It's a place a husband can enjoy to enjoy the fruits of his relationship. But the point is here, it talks about it being a fountain. It talks about it being a well of living waters, a stream from Lebanon. A fountain is fresh, flowing, bubbly, not stagnant. And that's what your sexual relationship ought to be. And when it becomes stagnant, it's not good. So keep it fresh. Keep it flowing. Keep it new. Don't let yourself get in a rut in your sexual relationship. And then the second word I want you to look at in Proverbs chapter 5 is the word rejoice, to rejoice with the wife of thy youth. And the word rejoice literally means to be overjoyed, fun, exciting. Go over to Genesis chapter 26 and look at verse number 8. Genesis chapter 26 and verse number 8. Now, this is when Isaac and his wife, there's a real problem here, but notice what it says in verse 8. I just want you to see something. It says, and it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out the window and saw, and behold, Isaac was sporting with Rebekah, his wife. Now, he told everybody it was his sister. So the king looks out, and they must have been doing something that a guy wouldn't do with his sister. And so that word sporting is there's some kind of a foreplay going on. Now, you should be very careful when you're out in public that you're not doing things that should be in the privacy of your own bedroom, and you be very careful with that. And it doesn't mean that they were actually doing some things that were wrong. It may have just been that they were kissing or hugging or whatever it might have been, but it was very obvious that they were a husband and wife and not a brother and sister. See, the sporting equals to sport, play, make sport, toy with, or make a toy of. All those definitions are there in the Hebrew. And that's describing your relationship as a husband and wife. Would you define your sexual relationship as a sport? Would you define it as something that you guys play and enjoy together? So it's just to rejoice with one another and sport. And it says to rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Go over to Malachi chapter 2, the very last book of the Old Testament. Malachi chapter 2, and look at verse number 14. Yet ye say, wherefore, because the Lord hath been witness between thee and the wife of thy youth, against whom thou hast dealt treacherously, yet is she thy companion and the wife of thy covenant. And so again, he's saying, listen, this is the person you married. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is this. We live in a world that glorifies youth. But the thing is, all of us in here, we're not young anymore. And the world says you need that young wife, you need that young husband. But he says rejoice in the wife of thy youth. Even as she grows older, you still need to rejoice in one another sexually. It's kind of like one guy said when he turned 40, he said to his wife, maybe I should trade you on a 220-year-olds. And she said, you're not wired for 220. And, we just need to adjust. What I'm trying to say here is those of you that are older and gone on years now, you've got to adjust in your relationship with them, including this area. That's why I recommend the book, The Act of Marriage After 40, because life changes and your needs changes and your response changes. But this area has to continue. No matter how old you are, whether you're 40 or 50 or even 90 years old, it's still part of that relationship. It's going to change, but it still needs to be part of that relationship. Youth is fleeting. And if you don't adjust in this area as you grow together as a married couple, you're going to hit problems. And so you've got to learn how to adjust. And that's why it's good to read some of these books, to talk about it and talk about how things have changed. And what you liked 20 years ago is not what you like today. And there's different needs that you have, and you need to adjust to those things. And then it says to be as a loving hind and as a pleasant roe. As a loving hind, as a pleasant roe. Let's look at Song of Solomon again here, chapter 2 and verse 9. It says, my beloved is like a roe or a young hart. Behold, he standeth behind our wall. He looketh forth at the windows, showing himself through the lattice. And then in Song of Solomon chapter 4 and verse 5, thy two breasts are like two young roes that are twins, which feed among the lilies. And then chapter 7 and verse number 3, thy two breasts are like two young roes that are twins. And so when we talk about a loving hind and a pleasant roe, there are different kinds of animals. The first thing is it's talking about loving. It means the word loving, as a loving hind and a pleasant roe, the word loving means amorous or lovers. So there needs to be an amorous, you've heard that word before, that you're kind of flirt with each other. You kind of, again, sometimes, especially wives, but it can be the other way around, but especially wives will say, well, he just, he comes up and touches me and does things. That's part of your relationship. And there's nothing wrong with that. Now, fellas, if you overdo it, if that's all she feels like you ever do, then that's a different matter. But the Bible says to be amorous with one another, to be loving with one another. The word hind, it's the idea of being sure or confident. Go over to Habakkuk chapter 3. Habakkuk chapter 3. It's right before Zephaniah, if that helps you out, and right after Nahum. Habakkuk chapter 3, and look at verse number 19. Habakkuk 3:19. The Lord God is my strength, and he will make my feet like hinds' feet, and he will make me to walk upon mine high places, the chief singer on my stringed instruments. When I read in the Bible, when God uses an object lesson, stop and meditate on that object lesson. And he says to be as a loving hind and a pleasant roe. Now, basically, those are two animals, and so there's a similarity, but God chose, he could have just said as a loving hind, he could have said as a loving and a pleasant hind, but he said a loving hind and a pleasant roe. So whenever I see something like that, I want to find out, well, what's the difference between a hind and a roe? And the best place to start is in the Bible and see what else it says. And then also you can look it up in a dictionary or on Google or wherever else it is. And the idea of the hind here is we see in Habakkuk chapter 3, it says, will make my feet like hinds' feet. So this was an animal that would climb onto places. You ever seen goats on the side of a mountain? You're saying, how in the world did that goat ever get up there? How did he climb up that side of the cliff like that? Because he had confidence. And I think the loving hind, what God is trying to say is, you need to be confident. You need to be confident. Confident in your relationship. Don't be hesitant. Don't be worried about, well, what's they thinking or rest of it. A husband and wife should be confident in one another. Now, to have confidence, I've got to trust you. And a lot of people are not confident in their sexual relationship because they're not confident in their partner. But the loving hind is have confidence. Pleasant, the word pleasant means favor, grace, or charm. The root word means mercy or pity. Sometimes you wives just need to have mercy on your husband. Okay, well, I'll have sex with you. Just have mercy and pity because he needs it, or vice versa. But the idea of this word pleasant is don't do it with an attitude. You're granting favor, grace, charm. See, a lot of times it's like, okay, that's not the way it should be. It should be out of grace and charm. I'm not doing this as a favor for you. I'm giving you a favor. I'm giving you something of myself. And then the roe is a female mountain goat. Now, I'm not sure if I'd want to be compared to a female mountain goat, ladies, but that's what it is. And Solomon actually does that as well in Song of Solomon chapter 4, verse 5. In chapter 7, verse 3, it uses the word gazelle, and the word gazelle means beauty. Again, where do these come in? A female mountain goat, the idea of that word, I think, is like an animal in heat. You know, you ever see an animal in heat? It's got to have it now. And that's the way we should be with our spouses sometimes. I've got to have you now. And then the gazelle was just beauty. It's just like a cute little animal. It's just a beautiful thing. So just kind of meditate on what it means to be a loving hind and a pleasant roe. And then number D, let her breasts satisfy thee at all times. And again, this is another reason not to look at pornography, not to look at other women, because you need to be satisfied with your spouse. And vice versa as well. Proverbs chapter 7 and verse number 18. Proverbs chapter 7 and verse number 18. The Bible says, come, let us take our fill of love until the morning. Let us solace ourselves with loves. Hey, make love all night. You ought to be satisfied. And then go over to, you could read, if you read through chapter 7, verses 6 through 23, in actuality, this was talking about a strange woman who tempted a young man to have sex outside of the relationship. And that was definitely wrong. And there's a lot of good warnings in here. But I do think within the marriage relationship, we ought to be satisfied. And here's the point I want to make with this. How much should satisfy? By the way, I skipped number 5. Go back to 5. The roe and the hart. In the Song of Solomon, that was then in chapter 2, verse 9, it's talking about Solomon. It's comparing Solomon to a roe and a hart. Be like a stag. Put the word stag or a buck there. You're my stag. You're my buck. You're my stud, if you want to use that word there. Okay? All right. But how much should satisfy? Go to Song of Solomon, chapter 8 and verse 7. Again, sometimes, and it could be both husbands and wives, often it's the husband that complains more, but there are many relationships where the wife wants more sex than the husband does, and that's the challenge of it. But in Song of Solomon, chapter 8 and verse 7, it says, many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. If a man would get all the substance of a house for love, it would utterly be condemned. In other words, you know, what is going to satisfy you? And a lot of times we look at our partner and say, well, they'll never be satisfied. But see, our job, according to 1 Corinthians 7, and this passage and others, is to satisfy their needs. So if they're not satisfied, I'm not doing my job as a spouse. And the challenge is, in many relationships, we have different needs. And one needs more than the other, or there's different things, and we've got to balance those two out. Now, if I'm the one with the greater need, I also have to take into account that my wife or your husband has less need, and sometimes to satisfy them, might need to do a little bit less, and they need to do a little bit more, and we need to come to that middle ground. Often I get asked the question, well, what's the average number of times a married couple has sex? And according to Google, the average is 1.7 times per week is the average. If the median is about 2.5. Now, you know there's a difference between average and medium. So median is about 2.5. And so if you're above average, go home today, and on your way home in the car or when you get home in your bedroom, turn to your spouse and say, thank you. If you're above 1.7 times a week on average, then you need to say, thank you. We're above average. Now, if you're below average, don't go home and say, hey, we got a problem here, okay? You do have a problem. You may need to look at it, but there's no such thing as the average person. Every couple has different needs. And for another different couples, 6 may not be enough, and for another couple, 1 is enough. But it needs to satisfy one another. Until both partners are satisfied, then we can't stop working on this. Look at Matthew, or 1 Corinthians chapter, that should be 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I don't know how it got Matthew down there. I don't think it's supposed to be Matthew. Let me just double check that real quick. But I'm pretty sure it's 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Yeah, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7 says, judge not. So don't judge your spouse on this whole area, okay? And again, you don't go home and say, hey, we're below average. We got to get busy here, okay? You go home and talk about what are my needs? more importantly, you go home and look at your spouse and say, am I meeting your need? And if you're not meeting their need, then you need to get working at it. Now, don't get focusing on numbers and say we got to do this many times or we're not. That's not what it's about. It's about meeting one another's needs. By the way, in a lot of these articles where I looked this up, it said over and over again that married couples, as a rule, have more sex than unmarried couples. So sometimes we're looking at the world saying, man, these guys are having sex all the time. Married couples have more sex on average than unmarried couples do. And they have better sex by their own self-reporting than unmarried couples do. And so that's something to keep in mind. Now, it is not fair to compare. It is not fair to compare. The point I want to make here is this, is the Bible says, be satisfied with the breasts of the wife of thy youth. And if you're constantly comparing your spouse's physical features, whether it's her breast or his tummy or whatever else it is, you're comparing it with people around you, that's not fair. There was a day that people did not see the opposite sex naked until the day they got married and went on their honeymoon. Today, we see it all around us. Today, it's flaunted at us. And it's tough not to compare with one another, especially when the world has a standard that they flaunt through the media. And we need to be careful in this area. Matthew chapter 5, it says that if we look upon a woman with lust in our heart. In Job chapter 31, Job said, I made a covenant with mine eyes that I would not look upon a woman, upon a maid. And then later on in verse 7, he said, my heart is going to follow after mine eyes. And fellows, let me challenge you, because this is more of a challenge for men than for women, although women have a struggle with this as well. And what you need to do is you need to not look. There's one book, the title of the book is, my mind just went blank. Every Man's Battle. How many have ever read that book? Any of you guys ever read that? It's written a few years ago. There's another one called Every Young Man's Battle. And whether you have your son, if you have a son, read that book, you need to talk to him about this, because this is going to be a battle for your kids as they get in the teenage years and beyond. And you men know it as well. It's hard not to look. And we see it, whether it's on the TV or whether it's on the media, other media, or whether it's out in the public or wherever it is, it's just flaunted. And we've got to not look. And I don't care whether she's dressed or not dressed correctly, don't look. If you're on the internet, get away from there as quick as you can. If you're watching a TV program, change the channel or turn it off, or at least turn your head away. If you're walking down the street, don't focus in. And it's a book he talked about bouncing your eyes. When I first read that, I thought, well, that just means you kind of bounce away from what you're looking at. But I think the idea, what you want to learn to do is don't focus. Because we can do that with a woman that's not dressed modestly. You can do that with a woman that's dressed modestly as well. Is we focus in. And I don't want to focus on that person. And focus on another woman. I want to keep my focus on my wife. And one other little hint that can help sometimes is when sometimes you have no choice in the matter. Sometimes it's like, this is just what I'm seeing, and you can't help it. I remember when I was working downtown, when we first started church, I worked down in Waikiki in the Gold Coast area down by the fountain. I managed an apartment building down there. One day I got on the elevator, and right before the door closed, somebody said, hold the elevator, and a lady came running in there, and she was undressed in a bikini. I mean, there was hardly anything there. And when you're standing in the elevator, what are you going to do? You know, you're stuck. And you see that, and it's, you know, no matter if you look at it or not, it's already in your mind. And when that happens, turn your focus to your spouse. And think about them rather than that person. Don't let your mind dwell upon, because what's going to happen is the world wants you to compare. And folks, your wife and your husband can't compete. I told you, I read an article one time about they'd done a movie about a Playboy bunny centerfold, and the actress who played in that, I never saw the movie, I was reading the article, and she said in the article that as part of the movie, they took a centerfold spread of her, you know, naked, and like they do for the magazine, and she said when she saw the pictures of herself, she said, I can't compete with that woman. Now the pictures were of her. And because they were photoshopped, or at that time, whatever, touched up and different angles and stuff, she could not compete with that ideal. And so when the Bible says to be satisfied with your wife, when you're constantly looking at something else, you're not going to be satisfied. Focus on what's good about your spouse. We all have bad parts. We all have the parts we're not happy with, and our spouse may not be happy with. But, the Bible says that love covereth the multitude of sin. And sometimes that means focusing on the good and not focusing on the negative, the bad parts. But don't compare. That's not fair. Men compare physically. Women tend to compare emotionally. Boy, if I had a husband that was nice like that, if I had a husband that would treat me like that. And that's how they tend to compare. Okay, number 3 is be satisfied with what you have. Be satisfied with what you have. Song of Solomon, chapter 8, and verses 8 through 10. Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verses 8 through 10. We have a little sister, and she hath no breast. What shall we do for our sister in the day when she shall be spoken for? If she be a wall, we will build upon her a palace of silver. And if she be a door, we will enclose her with boards of cedar. Her brothers were talking about when she was little, they were going to wall her up and not let anybody get close to her. But they talked about her being flat-chested. Now, I don't know if she ever developed or not. But the point is, I don't know that there's a woman in the world that's happy with her body, even when they're perfect. Again, I've read articles about these movie starlets who are supposed to be the perfect woman, and they talk about how they're not happy with their body. And we need to be careful of this, and not only for ourselves, but also with our partner. I'm amazed at the number of men who are critical of their wife's body, and I'm thinking, you idiot. What good is it doing you being critical? Especially if you're being critical of something she can't change. You chose her. And it's something she can't. You need to be satisfied with what you have. This is the person you chose. And even if they're not exactly as they were the day you married them, this is still the person you chose. And so be satisfied. Don't focus on the negative, focus on the positive. Hide and highlight what you have. Go over to Proverbs chapter 31. Proverbs chapter 31 and verse number 18 says, she perceiveth that her merchandise is good, her candle goeth not out by night. A lot of times I won't tell you, I don't have sex with my husband because I feel like I'm fat and I'm ugly. And first of all, that's not the important thing. Because you're his wife, and he doesn't get anybody else. And you have all the parts that he's interested in. And you have all the parts that are necessary to have a physical relationship. And so instead of focusing on your negatives, hide and highlight. For you personally, like when you dress, ladies, you know how to do this. You wear outfits that hide the bad parts and highlight the good parts. And that's something good to do in the bedroom. That's what negligees are good for. They can hide the bad parts and highlight the good parts. What is your husband like? And put the focus on that. And men, when you're looking at your wife, you look at the good and don't focus on the bad. And be thankful that you've got someone who's got all the parts in all the right places and it works. And we need to highlight and hide and highlight using wisdom. Again, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8, the Bible says that love covereth a multitude of sins. It's kind of like when Noah's sons found him naked in the bedroom. When he went and told his brother, what did his brothers do? They walked in with a blanket backwards and covered their father. Why? Because they didn't want to see him that way. Not only do you never want to see your parents naked to begin with, that's gross. But secondly, that's not how they wanted to think of their dad. Their dad was a godly man who made a stupid mistake, and they didn't want to focus on the bad thing. They want to focus on the good. And sometimes in a sexual relationship, that's what you have to learn to do, is focus and hide and highlight. And then letter E, ravished. Be ravished with her. The Bible tells us in Proverbs chapter 5 and verse number 19, let us be a loving hind, a pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy at all times, and be ravished always with her love. The word ravished literally means to be intoxicated, to be intoxicated. In Song of Solomon chapter 4 and verses 9 and 10. A couple other places does the same thing. It says, thou hast ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. Thou hast ravished my heart with one of thine eyes, with one chain of thy neck. How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse. How much better is thy love than wine, and the smell of thine ointments than all spices. Those of you who know me, I believe it's wrong for a Christian to drink. I think the Bible's clear on that. I don't think there's any. Sometimes couples say, well, we have a little wine when we're going to have sex together. It doesn't. It doesn't make it better. It makes it worse, because wine is an inhibitor. And it does the wrong things to you when you want to have sex. But what he's trying to say here, what they're saying here is they're not saying wine's okay. They're saying, listen, I don't need wine because I get just totally lost in love. I mean, it's like I've lost all control. It's like it's better than wine. It's better than any high you can get. And this is what's good. And it's also interesting, the word ravished can also be translated as err or astray. Look again at Proverbs chapter 5 and look at verse number 23. Proverbs chapter 5 and verse number 23. It says, he shall die without instruction, in the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. It's the same root word as ravish. First of all, I don't think you can go astray with your husband or wife. The marriage bed is honorable. A lot of times people ask me, well, Pastor, what's okay to do and what's not okay to do? Now, there's some things that are clearly okay. Pornography, wrong. Having another person involved in that relationship, wrong. But after that, the Bible's not real clear on this topic. And I think it's very, very hard for a husband and wife to go astray if both of them agree. Now, there's certain questions, and I've got a booklet up here. If you haven't gotten a copy of this, I've given it out before, but it's called Sex Problems and Questions for Married Couples. And what I did in this little booklet is I tried to take a synopsis of the Christian authors that I've read and what they teach on different questions I've got. Because it's hard to ask your pastor questions like, is it okay to have oral sex? That's not the thing you want to ask your pastor, okay? And it's just uncomfortable to deal with that. And it's kind of a personal issue. And what about other things that we can do? And so what I try to do in this booklet is to take what the Bible says and what Christian authors say on these topics and kind of summarize it for you. And so this is a booklet I would encourage all of you to get a copy of. In fact, rather than make you come up here in the front and do that, Brother Mitchell, if you can get this and have that in the back for them as they go out. If you've already got a copy, then you don't need to get another one. If you don't have a copy or if I run out, I'll make some more for you. I thought I had enough for everybody here. But it's something I would read together as a couple and talk about and discuss. But I'll tell you this, I think it's hard to go astray with your spouse. God says the marriage bed, what's done in the bedroom between a loving husband and a loving wife, not forced on each other. When you're trying to force, and don't go home and say, well, your pastor says it's okay. Don't do that, because I don't say it's okay. I tell you what Christian authors say, and I give you a little bit of biblical basis, and then you've got to determine what's right or wrong for you, okay? And you can do further studies. Some of these books talk about it as well. But in the end, if your spouse isn't comfortable with it, don't force it. Now, as a loving spouse, you want to kind of be willing to explore and expand a little bit, flowing relationship, the fountain attitude. But there is limits because of many different reasons. A lot of times women are especially reluctant because they've been abused in the past and something that was done to them they don't want to do now. And sometimes it's because we were taught that way or we've always considered. There's a lot of reasons why. And so it's important for you to discuss this and openly and lovingly with each other and come to a conclusion together. And sometimes it's a process that you have to go through. And sometimes one of the others is saying, I can't go there. And a loving spouse will not try to force you to go there as well. But the point is you can go astray with a strange woman. You can go astray when you go in the wrong direction. But in the marriage bed, I think it's very difficult to do that. With some very clear exceptions, I think it really comes down to what you feel is right as a couple for you to do. There's not a clear answer in the Bible. You can go both ways. There are people that will go to the Song of Solomon. They can take you to a couple different verses. It sounds like they're having oral sex. And so you've got to take a look at that and decide what's right for you and what's wrong for you. But here's the thing, and we're going to end here, that I want to make sure we're clear on. And that is, if you're a married couple and you're not having sex, whether it's 1.7 times a week or whatever it is, and you're not satisfying your spouse's needs, then you're sinning. You read 1 Corinthians chapter 7. You look at all the verses in Genesis and Matthew and other places where it says he leaves his father and mother, cleaves to his wife, and they become one flesh. It is an important part of the marriage relationship. And if it's not happening, you need to start working towards that goal. And sometimes the best thing to do is just break the ice and let's do it. And sometimes it needs some loving prayer and study and talking and working through some issues to get back to that point of a flowing, growing physical relationship. And so we're going to finish this up next week and going through that. On the back of your last page that you got today, there's an article called Repack Your Baggage. And that's this. Fellas, you need to understand, almost every woman in this room at some point in her life has been sexually abused in some way or another. Minor or major. You've seen this campaign, Me Too. And how many women are coming out with it because it happens. And that is baggage she's carrying with her into your relationship. Now, you will never get rid of all the baggage, but you can take some of the weight out. You can make it lighter to carry. And sexual immorality. A very big percentage of women, 60% of people are not virgins when they get married. And that immorality, even when it was between the two of you before you got married, is baggage in your marriage, and it's affecting your sexual relationship. If you've not asked forgiveness of God and each other, it's causing problems. If the sex was with somebody else besides your spouse, it's causing problems because you brought another person in that bedroom. Now, you need to be careful how you deal with it, and the article talks about that a little bit, but it's there, and ignoring it isn't going to make it go away. And ladies, you understand, almost every man in this room at some point or another struggled with pornography. It's just a part of life today. And they may still struggle with it. And you need to understand that, and it's affecting the way he views your relationship. A lot of women, my wife was with a group of ladies one time, and they were talking about and how this all came up. Ladies seem to talk about things men don't do, but how it all came up. Some of the ladies said something about, my husband wanted to do this, and the other lady said, well, my husband did too. And she came home and said, where did that come from? I said, I can tell you, pornography. They saw it in pornography, and now they wanted their spouse to do it. Whether it was before they got married or recently or whatever, it's where it's coming from. And they struggle with that. And men, we're going to have a whole lesson on this. You got to deal with this because it's affecting your relationship. It's not making it better, it's making it worse. And we need to deal with that. All right, we're going to have to quit. I'm way over time. Let's go ahead and stand for submissive word of prayer.